Spontaneous human combustion. Fire is one of the oldest forces humanity has ever tamed. It warms us, it cooks our food, it drives our machines. But it is also one of the most destructive powers we know. We build our homes to resist it. We build entire cities of concrete and steel just to keep it contained. And yet, there exists a phenomenon so bizarre, so unsettling, that it almost sounds like a work of Gothic fiction. It is the idea that a human being can ignite and burn from within, without any external flame, without a spark, without a candle, without even a match. This phenomenon has a name: Spontaneous Human Combustion, or SHC for short. For centuries, people have whispered about it. The stories always follow a strange pattern. A victim is found burned, reduced to ash and cinders. In some cases, the entire torso and head are destroyed, leaving behind only a leg or an arm or part of the body completely untouched. And yet, the surroundings show little sign of fire. The furniture may be scorched, but not destroyed. Curtains may remain hanging. A newspaper sitting nearby is unharmed. The paradox is chilling. How can a fire so completely consume a person, yet leave the environment nearly intact? The first reaction many people have when hearing about spontaneous human combustion is disbelief. Surely this is impossible. Surely there must be an explanation. And scientists have offered many, from the so-called wick effect, where a body essentially burns like a human candle, to theories involving alcohol, gases, or static electricity. Skeptics say there is always a rational cause, but then there are the cases. Take Mary Reeser, a 67-year-old woman from Florida. In 1951, she was found almost entirely reduced to ash in her armchair. Only her left foot, still wearing a slipper, remained intact. The room around her was oddly untouched. A few scorch marks, a partly damaged chair, but no signs of a raging blaze. Fire investigators could not explain how a body could be so thoroughly incinerated without destroying the rest of the room. Or the case of Dr. John Irving Bentley, an elderly physician from Pennsylvania. In 1966, he was discovered as a pile of ash in his bathroom. All that remained was his right leg, still inside a slipper, stretched out across the floor. A small hole had burned through the linoleum, but the rest of the house was unharmed. And then there is Jeannie Saffin, a 61-year-old woman from London. In 1982, she suddenly erupted in flames while sitting in her kitchen. Her father, horrified, claimed he saw fire coming from her mouth, like a dragon breathing fire. Yet her clothing was not as badly damaged as her skin. Jeannie was taken to hospital, but she died from her injuries. In this case, there were witnesses, and they swore that the fire came from within her.
These cases are not isolated. From the 1600s to modern times, dozens of reports exist, and each one shares the same disturbing details: bodies consumed by fire in ways that defy explanation. The phenomenon became so famous that it slipped into literature and pop culture. In Charles Dickens's novel Bleak House, a character dies from spontaneous combustion, a scene so controversial that Dickens was accused of promoting pseudoscience. Dickens defended himself by citing real cases. In the 20th century, the mystery became a staple of tabloids, documentaries, and horror stories. Even today, when someone dies in a fire under strange conditions, whispers of SHC return. But what exactly is happening? Is this phenomenon real? A genuine danger that science has yet to fully explain? Or is it an illusion, a misunderstanding, a product of accidents and exaggeration? That is the mystery we are about to explore. In this documentary, we will travel back to the earliest reports in Europe, where physicians and priests debated whether SHC was punishment from God. We will examine the most famous cases from the 18th century to modern times, each one more bizarre than the last. We will break down the scientific theories that try to explain it: the wick effect, alcohol, methane, static electricity, and ask whether any of them truly fit the evidence. We will hear the words of witnesses, people who claim to have seen loved ones suddenly burst into flames. And finally, we will explore the cultural impact, why spontaneous human combustion continues to haunt our imagination, even in the age of science and reason. Because whether real or not, SHC taps into a primal fear: The fear that our bodies might betray us, that fire might come from within, and that death could arrive in the most horrifying way possible, not with illness, not with age, not with accident, but in an instant of fire. This is the story of spontaneous human combustion, a story of mystery, of tragedy, and of one of the strangest unsolved questions in human history.
Ancient and early accounts. The first written report. The first widely cited description of SHC comes from 1641 in a medical text by Danish physician Thomas Bartholin. Bartholin was a respected anatomist, famous for describing the human lymphatic system. Yet among his careful studies, he included a case so bizarre that it read more like folklore than medicine. He described a woman in Paris who, while sleeping in bed, was consumed by fire and reduced to ashes, but her straw mattress was left completely untouched. According to Bartholin, the only explanation was that she had ignited from within, a fire with no external spark. This case shocked European readers. Fire was one of the most feared dangers of the time. Entire cities had burned down due to one stray candle, yet here was a story of a body burning without any candle at all. The Italian Night. Another often cited early account is that of Polonus Vorstius, a knight in 15th century Italy. The story, retold in later centuries, claims that Vorstius was enjoying a drink of wine at his home when he suddenly erupted into flames in front of his parents. His entire body was consumed, leaving little behind, but the chair he sat upon was reportedly untouched. Though some historians doubt whether Vorstius truly existed, the tale circulated widely in the 1600s and 1700s, fueling the belief that alcohol itself could make the human body flammable. Many early reports of SHC described victims as heavy drinkers, often elderly, and sometimes women who lived sedentary lives. The Venetian Countess. Perhaps the most famous early case occurred in 1731. The victim was Countess Cornelia de Bandi, an elderly noblewoman in Cesena, Italy. Servants found her remains one morning in her bedroom. Her body was almost entirely reduced to ash. Only her legs and part of her skull were left intact. What made this case chilling was the detail in the report. Her bed and furniture were only slightly scorched, though a greasy soot covered the walls and ceiling. Witnesses claimed her room smelled of smoke and burnt oil. The case was investigated and documented by local officials and later described in publications across Europe. It became one of the most cited examples of spontaneous human combustion in the 18th century. Religious explanations. In these early centuries, science had few answers for such cases, so religion often stepped in. Some theologians argued that SHC was a form of divine punishment. The victims, they claimed, were consumed by the fire of God's wrath for sins such as drunkenness or immoral living. This belief explains why so many early cases emphasize that the victims were heavy drinkers. In an era when alcoholism was considered sinful, it was easy to frame SHC as a moral warning. Drink too much, live without virtue, and you risk bursting into flames. It is telling that nearly every early case paints a portrait of victims as gluttonous, elderly, or living alone. These were people on the margins of society, whose deaths could be interpreted as lessons for the living. The 18th century surge. By the 1700s, reports of SHC were becoming more common. Physicians, natural philosophers, and writers debated the phenomenon in medical journals and pamphlets. Some attempted to offer natural explanations, but most leaned on the idea of internal fire caused by alcohol, poor health, or divine justice. One English physician, Dr. Jonas Dupont, published a book in 1763 titled De Incendiis Corporis Humani Spontaneis, on spontaneous combustion of the human body. Dupont collected and analyzed cases, arguing that SHC was real, though rare. His work gave the subject legitimacy, inspiring debate in medical circles for decades. Literature and SHC. By the late 18th century, spontaneous combustion had entered the realm of literature. Authors began using it as a dramatic plot device, blurring the line between fact and fiction. This trend would later culminate in the 19th century with Charles Dickens. But even before him, the idea of people bursting into flames captured the imagination of Gothic writers. The mix of real reports, medical speculation, religious moralizing, and fictional dramatization meant that by the dawn of the 19th century, SHC was firmly embedded in European consciousness. It was no longer just a strange report from a distant village. It was a phenomenon that educated people, doctors, and writers openly debated. A growing mystery. Looking back on these early cases, a pattern emerges. Victims are found almost completely incinerated, often with limbs left intact. Surroundings are strangely undamaged. A greasy residue coats nearby objects. Explanations range from punishment by God to alcohol fires inside the body. And though we may be tempted to dismiss these stories as superstition, the same exact details appear in modern cases centuries later, from Mary Reeser in 1951 to Michael Faherty in 2010. If the early accounts were just moral tales or exaggerations, how do they match so eerily with scientific investigations of recent decades? The mystery was only beginning. And in the 19th century, spontaneous combustion would become both a scientific curiosity and a cultural obsession. Science meets Gothic horror. SHC in the Age of Reason. The 1800s were a century of rapid change. Steam power was transforming cities. Electricity was beginning to intrigue scientists. Medicine was evolving from superstition into clinical science. Yet, reports of people bursting into flames refused to disappear. Doctors began cataloging SHC cases, attempting to classify them as real medical phenomena. Some suggested internal gases could ignite. Others claimed fatty tissue acted as fuel, particularly in overweight or alcoholic victims. Still others dismissed it outright as superstition, noting that every supposed case could be explained by accidents. A tipped-over candle, a dropped pipe, a careless ember from a fireplace. The mystery of SHC became a battlefield of belief. Skeptics versus believers, science versus folklore. The case of Nicole Millet. One case that lingered into the 19th century debates was the death of Nicole Millet in Paris in 1725. She was found incinerated in her bed, with little damage to the room. Her husband was accused of murder. The court, however, accepted testimony that she had died of spontaneous combustion due to alcoholism. This case set a legal precedent. The idea that SHC could be used in court as an official cause of death meant that it carried enormous cultural weight. By the 19th century, this case was still cited in both scientific and popular discussions of the mystery. SHC and the rise of Gothic literature. The 1800s also saw the rise of Gothic horror fiction, novels filled with gloomy castles, supernatural forces, and grotesque deaths. SHC, with its blend of fire and mystery, was irresistible to writers. The most famous example comes from Charles Dickens, who used spontaneous combustion to kill a character in his novel Bleak House, 1853. The character Crook, a greedy alcoholic old man, is found reduced to a pile of ashes, with nothing but scorched remains left behind. Dickens was criticized by readers and even scientists who accused him of sensationalizing a myth, but Dickens defended himself fiercely. He pointed out that multiple medical writers had documented cases of SHC. In the preface to later editions of Bleak House, he wrote, "I shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable body of opposite authority." By putting SHC into a best-selling novel, Dickens ensured that the phenomenon leapt from obscure medical journals into popular culture. From then on, the idea of people bursting into flames was not just a medical curiosity, it was entertainment. 19th century medical debate. While writers thrilled audiences with tales of fiery deaths, physicians attempted to settle the matter. Alcohol hypothesis. Many 19th century doctors believed heavy drinking saturated the body with alcohol, essentially making victims flammable. Chronic alcoholics, they said, were walking fire hazards. This fit with the moral narratives of the time, where SHC was viewed as punishment for vice. Fat and ignition hypothesis. Others argued that human fat, once ignited, could sustain combustion. In obese or elderly victims, fat acted like candle wax, fueling a slow but thorough burn. This would later evolve into the modern wick effect theory. Skeptics. Still others dismissed SHC entirely. They argued that every so-called case could be explained by an external flame. A candle falling onto clothing, a coal rolling from the fireplace, or a knocked-over lamp could explain the burn patterns. The problem was that many SHC cases had details that resisted these explanations. Rooms that weren't destroyed, objects nearby left intact, victims burned beyond what household fires could achieve. SHC in newspapers. The Victorian press loved SHC. Newspapers reported lurid accounts of people found burned to cinders in their homes. Sensational illustrations showed shadowy figures erupting in fire. For a public fascinated by science but still steeped in ghost stories, SHC represented both the wonder of discovery and the horror of the unexplained. It also reflected anxieties about the body and morality. The typical SHC victim in reports was elderly, often female, sometimes a drinker, and socially isolated. The stories were moral warnings disguised as mysteries, warnings against drinking, laziness, or indulgence. The skeptical turn. By the late 19th century, advances in fire science began to undermine belief in SHC. Chemists showed that alcohol in the body could not cause combustion. It burned too quickly and dispersed too fast. Fire investigators pointed out that the phenomenon of slow smoldering fires could explain many cases. Clothing could ignite, and fat could act as fuel, but these processes took hours. The term wick effect was not yet coined, but the principles were being understood. A human body could indeed be consumed by fire in unusual ways, but there was no need to invoke supernatural causes. Still, even as scientific skepticism grew, public fascination did not fade. SHC continued to straddle the line between respectable science and sensational myth, a perfect symbol of the 19th century's uneasy dance with modernity. Legacy of the 19th century. By the end of the Victorian era, spontaneous human combustion had become more than a curiosity. It was now a medical puzzle debated in journals, a moral warning linked to alcoholism and vice, a literary trope immortalized by Dickens, a tabloid spectacle fueling sensational headlines. The 19th century did not solve the mystery of SHC, but it gave it shape, depth, and a cultural presence that persists even today. When the 20th century dawned, investigators would bring new tools, forensic science, photography, chemistry, to examine the mystery, and what they found would shock the modern world. Famous 20th century cases. The case of Mary Reeser, 1951, Florida, USA. The first major modern case exploded into public consciousness in the summer of 1951 in St. Petersburg, Florida. Mary Hardy Reeser was a 67-year-old widow who lived quietly in her apartment. On the morning of July 2nd, her landlady came to deliver a telegram. She noticed the doorknob was unusually hot to the touch. Alarmed, she called the police. When authorities forced their way inside, they were met with a horrific sight. Mary Reeser's body had been almost entirely reduced to ash. Only her left foot, still inside a black satin slipper, remained intact. A section of her spine and fragments of her skull were also found. But the strangest detail was the room. While the chair she sat in had been destroyed, the rest of the apartment showed only minor smoke damage. Plastic light switches nearby had melted. Yet newspapers stacked on a table just a few feet away were untouched. Fire investigators were baffled. How could a blaze hot enough to reduce a human body to ash, a process that normally requires a crematorium at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, not have consumed the entire apartment? The FBI was even consulted. Their report suggested that Mary had accidentally set herself on fire while smoking a cigarette. But critics pointed out that a cigarette could not possibly generate the temperatures needed to destroy almost an entire body. The case made headlines worldwide, earning Mary Reeser the chilling nickname, the Cinder Lady. To this day, no definitive explanation exists. The case of Dr. John Irving Bentley. 15 years later, another case shocked investigators, this time in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. On the morning of December 5, 1966, a meter reader named Don Gosnell entered the home of Dr. John Irving Bentley, a 92-year-old retired physician. As Gosnell made his way through the house, he noticed a strange smoke and a hole burned into the bathroom floor. Peering inside, he saw a pile of ash. When investigators arrived, they discovered what remained of Dr. Bentley. His entire body had been incinerated, leaving only his right leg, still wearing a slipper, stretched out across the bathroom floor. A walking frame was nearby, partly melted. The rest of the house showed little fire damage, aside from the small hole burned through the linoleum. The local coroner's report could not explain how a man had been reduced almost entirely to ash without destroying the surrounding bathroom. Skeptics suggested that Bentley may have dropped his pipe while smoking, igniting his clothing. But, as with Mary Reeser, this did not account for the intensity and completeness of the burn. The image of Bentley's lonely, slippered leg became one of the most famous photographs associated with SHC, printed in books and articles for decades. The case of Jeannie Saffin. Unlike most SHC cases, which are discovered after the fact, the death of Jeannie Saffin had eyewitnesses. On September 15, 1982, Jeannie, a 61-year-old woman with a learning disability, was sitting in the kitchen of her family's home in Edmonton, London. Her father, Jack, and brother-in-law, Don Carroll, were present. According to Jack, flames suddenly erupted from Jeannie's upper body, specifically from her face and hands. He later described it as like a dragon breathing fire. Carroll claimed flames shot out of her mouth. Both men insisted there was no external source of ignition, no candles, no matches, no cigarettes. Jeannie's clothing did not ignite in the way one would expect. Though she suffered severe burns, her clothes were less damaged than her skin. She was rushed to the hospital but died 8 days later. The coroner listed her cause of death as burn shock, but Jack Saffin swore that what he saw was not natural. He testified that his daughter had burst into flames from within. The Saffin case reignited debate around SHC, precisely because it was not based on charred remains alone. There were living witnesses who claimed to have seen spontaneous flames engulf a person. The case of Michael Faherty. The most recent high-profile case occurred in 2010 in Galway, Ireland. On December 22nd, the body of Michael Faherty, a 76-year-old man, was discovered in his home. His body had been almost entirely destroyed by fire, with only part of his torso remaining. The damage was largely confined to the body itself and the floor beneath him. Nearby objects were scorched but not consumed, and there was no evidence of an external fire source. At the inquest, coroner Dr. Ciaran McLaughlin made a shocking ruling. Faherty's death was caused by spontaneous human combustion. He explained that the fire was confined to the body, that no accelerant was found, and that the most logical explanation was SHC. This ruling marked one of the few times in modern history that SHC was officially recorded as a cause of death on legal documents. Other modern reports. These 4 cases are the most famous, but they are not alone. Throughout the 20th century, newspapers reported dozens of similar incidents. In 1938, a woman in Chelmsford, England, was found burned to ash, her body reduced to powder but her bedclothes intact. In 1959, a woman in Brazil was reportedly consumed by fire while sitting at her kitchen table, with neighbors claiming to see flames shooting from her body. In 1967, a man in Leeds, UK, was discovered incinerated in his living room, his pipe still resting on the arm of his chair. While not all cases were as well documented as Mary Reeser's or Dr. Bentley's, they followed the same disturbing pattern. Why these cases shocked the world. The 20th century SHC cases carried more weight than their earlier counterparts for three reasons. Forensic science. By the mid-1900s, investigators had advanced tools. These were not medieval peasants reporting superstitions. These were trained professionals baffled by what they saw. Media coverage. Newspapers, radio, and eventually television spread these cases around the world, amplifying the sense of mystery. Photographic evidence. Unlike earlier centuries, some cases had photographs of the remains, haunting images that fueled the imagination and convinced many that SHC was real. The cases of Mary Reeser, Dr. Bentley, Jeannie Saffin, and Michael Faherty remain the cornerstones of SHC debates. Each one resisted easy explanation. Each one carried eerie details, intact limbs, untouched surroundings, sudden flames, that science struggled to reconcile. And yet, skeptics continued to argue that no one ever truly burst into flames. To them, there were always other explanations: accidents, cigarettes, faulty memories. But if SHC was nothing more than accidents, why did so many cases look alike across decades and continents? Why did the same bizarre details keep reappearing? The mystery deepened, and so did the need for answers.